You know, when you stand at the very edge of the Timberline, right where the dense, suffocating pine forests suddenly give way to the jagged, exposed granite of the upper elevations, there is this sudden, to sharp drop in temperature that hits the back of your neck almost like a physical warning. And the wind up there carries a specific metallic scent of incoming weather that can completely mask the sound of a person screaming just a few dozen yards away. It happens in the blink of an eye. Welcome back to the channel, folks. Ted, and for those of you who are just finding my work for the first time, my name is George Noory, and for well over 15 years now, I have dedicated my life to sifting through thousands of heavily redacted case files, just interviewing devastated families and hiking deep into the backcountry to document a highly specific, deeply unsettling series of unexplained disappearances that are happening right under our noses in the national parks of North America. About 10 or 12 years ago, I was approached by two off-duty park rangers who recognized me as an investigative author, and they told me that they had met up, exchanged stories from different parks they had worked at, and figured out there was a recurring series of vanishings where the victims shared incredibly bizarre profiles, and when these rangers tried to dig into the old archives to find the truth, they were completely thwarted by the very agencies supposed to protect us. They were told to drop it. Just this past week, I received an email from a viewer who had been hiking near the tree line out in Colorado, and they described this overwhelming primal sense of being watched, this sudden drop in ambient sound where the birds and the insects just stop making noise, which is exactly the kind of environmental precursor we see in so many of these historical case files. It just makes you wonder. So anyway, tonight we are going to look at a highly disturbing cluster of cases centered around a very specific geographical feature, the Timberline, starting with one of the most heavily documented yet profoundly baffling mysteries in United States history, involving a small child who vanished without a single trace in the Great Smoky Mountains. But we aren't going to stop there, because I want to show you how this exact same profile has repeated itself in recent years up in the rugged, unforgiving terrain of Yellowstone. When I sit in my office late at night and review these files side by side, what strikes me the most isn't just that people get lost, because, well, people do get lost and succumb to the elements all the time, but rather it's the verifiable anomalies in these specific cases, like highly trained tracking dogs that simply sit down and refuse to follow a scent, or the massive, unprecedented severe weather systems that roll in immediately after the disappearance, effectively washing away every single footprint, piece of clothing, and shred of physical evidence before the search and rescue teams can even get their boots on the ground. The storm erases everything. I don't claim to have all the answers, and my goal here is never to sensationalize the tragic loss of these families, but rather to present you with the hard, just documented facts from the official police and Park Service records so that you can see the glaring gaps for yourself, evaluate the evidence, and understand that there is a very real, undocumented danger lurking just beyond the safety of the marked trail. Let's dive into the files. Well, if we roll the calendar back to Father's Day weekend, right around June 14th of 1969, we find ourselves up at a place called Spence Field in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, an area that sits high up near the Appalachian Trail, where the open grassy balds meet these incredibly dense to almost impenetrable thickets of rhododendron and mountain laurel that can swallow a grown man whole if he takes just a few steps off the beaten path. It is unforgiving terrain. Bill Martin, a prominent and respected architect from Knoxville, had brought his two sons, 7-year-old Dennis and his older brother Douglas, along with his own father and another family, to spend the weekend camping and enjoying the crisp mountain air, taking in the smell of damp earth and crushed pine needles that makes those higher elevations feel so incredibly isolated and pristine. It was late in the afternoon, to around 4:30 p.m., when the sun starts casting those long, deceptive shadows across the high grass, and the temperature naturally begins to drop. And the boys decided they wanted to play a harmless little prank on the adults by sneaking around opposite sides of a thick patch of bushes to jump out and scare them. Dennis, who was wearing a bright red shirt that should have stuck out like a blazing beacon against the dark, muted greens of the forest canopy, took the path to the left, stepping just out of sight behind the heavy brush, while his father sat nearby talking with the other men and completely unaware that in just a few agonizing seconds his family's entire world was going to be permanently, irrevocably altered. He stepped behind the bush, and when the other boys jumped out laughing and Dennis didn't appear with them, Bill waited just a few moments, probably assuming his youngest was simply biding his time to get the perfect jump on them. But as the seconds ticked by and the woods remained completely still, that heavy, sickening knob of primal dread that every parent intimately understands began to form right in the pit of his stomach. Bill walked over to the bushes where his son had just vanished, a spot that was no more than maybe 20 or 30 yards away, expecting to find the boy crouching in the damp dirt and giggling. But all he found was the cold, indifferent silence of the Smoky Mountains staring back at him, without a single snapped twig or rustle of leaves to indicate which way the boy had gone. There was no sound at all. When I think back to that moment, putting myself in the shoes of a father out there in the fading twilight, running frantically along the edge of the tree line and screaming his child's name until his voice goes hoarse, hearing absolutely nothing but the wind moving through the canopy, it just breaks my heart because you can only imagine the sheer panic setting in as the reality of the situation takes hold. In all my years of research, looking into the eyes of parents who have lost children in these parks, there is a specific kind of hollow grief that never leaves them. Traumatic suspension of time because they simply have no body to bury and no story to make sense of the sudden, devastating loss. Within hours, what started as a desperate family scouring the immediate brush escalated into what would become one of the most massive, unprecedented search and rescue operations in the history of the National Park Service, eventually swelling to include over 1,000 searchers, park rangers, local volunteers, the FBI, and eventually heavily armed Green Berets. You have to understand the sheer brutal reality of searching in the Smokies, pushing through briars that physically tear at your clothes, navigating slippery granite drop-offs where one wrong step means a broken leg or worse. And doing all of this while knowing a 7-year-old boy is out there somewhere in the dark. And right on cue, to almost as if the environment itself was reacting to the disappearance, a pattern I've documented time and time again in these files, a massive, severe thunderstorm rolled into the Smokies that very night, dumping 2.5 inches of freezing torrential rain onto the mountain, dropping the temperatures drastically and effectively washing away any footprints, scent trails, or physical evidence that might have been left in the mud. The storm erased the mountain. When the authorities brought the tracking dogs in, and, these were highly trained bloodhounds that can follow a scent trail across solid asphalt days after the fact, they brought them right to the exact spot where Dennis was last seen standing, fully expecting a quick hit. But the handlers reported that the dogs just spun in circles, completely unable to pick up a direction of travel, as if the boy had simply evaporated directly into the heavy mountain air. The dogs just stopped. Now, what always strikes me as highly unusual in this specific case, and something, you see, when you jump forward from 1969 and you start looking at the sprawling geothermal landscape of Yellowstone National Park, bitter smell of sulfur hangs thick in the cold air, and the ground itself feels alive and completely unpredictable. You realize that the exact same baffling elements that surrounded the Dennis Martin disappearance are still happening today, right under our noses. I remember looking into the case of a young man named Stuart Isaac, who was driving cross-country back in 2010, taking a route that brought him through the twisting, incredibly isolated roads of Yellowstone on a freezing September evening where the lodgepole pines stand like silent, towering sentinels in the dark. Stewart's car was found abandoned at Craig Pass, a desolate high-altitude stretch of the Grand Loop Road, with the keys still sitting right there in the ignition and the engine totally cold, while his backpack and all of his personal belongings were left neatly inside the cabin just waiting for a driver who would simply never return to claim them. It makes absolutely no sense. According to the official park records, search dogs were brought out to the vehicle, sniffing the cracked asphalt and the surrounding brush where the autumn frost was just starting to harden on the dead grass. They couldn't establish any meaningful scent trail leading away from the car, which is a highly specific anomaly we see over and over again, from the wet rhododendrons of the Smokies all the way to the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The authorities searched the surrounding timber, combing through the heavy woods where the silence is so profound it actually rings in your ears and makes you feel entirely alone in the world. But they found absolutely zero indication that Stewart had wandered off into the trees to take a hike or to look at the scenery or to do anything that a normal tourist might do on a chilly Tuesday night. He just vanished. And then you look at a case like Aaron Hedges out in the crazy mountains just north of the Yellowstone ecosystem, a seasoned hunter who knew exactly how to navigate that brutal, steep terrain where the loose scree fields can slide out from under your boots in a heartbeat and send you tumbling hundreds of feet down into the dark timber. When Aaron was separated from his hunting party, it triggered a massive search effort through the freezing snow and the biting wind that cuts right through your heavy winter layers. But what the searchers eventually found months and years later completely defied any logical explanation of how a man, let alone a highly experienced outdoorsman, would behave when he was lost and fighting for his life in the cold. They found his boots and his gear neatly cached in locations that were miles away from where he should have been, separated by incredibly rugged, practically impassable ridges that no freezing, exhausted man in his bare feet could ever hope to cross. It defies all logic. Now, I know there are very smart, very analytical folks out there, places like the Data Skeptic podcast or the researchers over at the Lore Lodge, who look at these bizarre equipment drops and point out quite correctly that paradoxical undressing is a very real, scientifically documented symptom of late-stage hypothermia. The freezing person becomes delirious and strips off their clothes in the snow. And I absolutely agree that hypothermia happens in the wilderness, and it is a terrible way to go. But when you actually go out there and stand in the exact boulder fields where these items are recovered, feeling the sharp, jagged edges of the granite that would absolutely shred a pair of bare feet in a matter of seconds, you have to ask yourself how a dying, delirious man is traversing miles of this brutal landscape without leaving a single drop of blood or a scuff mark on the stones. The official reports just gloss over it. We see this exact same geographic profile repeating in cases where people go missing right at the edge of massive boulder fields or near bodies of water in the Yellowstone area, like the deeply unsettling disappearance of Morgan Heimer in 2015. A 22-year-old professional guide who knew the river currents and understood the backcountry better than almost anyone else out there. Tren was walking right near the edge of the roaring waters of the park, where the river cuts through the rocky canyons with a deafening roar that vibrates right up through the soles of your boots. And he stepped away for just a brief moment, leaving his group behind in the bright afternoon sun, and was never seen again, despite an extensive multi-day search involving highly trained swiftwater rescue teams, helicopters chopping through the sky, and dozens of people scouring the muddy banks and the cold rushing water. They never found a single trace of him floating downstream or snagged on a submerged log. The river just kept on running. When you look at the Proximi, Now, I want to be completely transparent with you folks tonight, because whenever you start compiling hard data on something as deeply unsettling and paradigm shifting as these geographic clusters of missing people, you are absolutely going to face a wall of pushback from the academic community, and frankly, in a healthy investigative process, you should welcome it. I read the critical articles published in the Skeptical Inquirer, and I listened to the highly analytical, intelligent folks over at the Data Skeptic podcast or the Lore Lodge who look at my research from the outside and they say, well, you know, David is just drawing a bullseye around the bullet holes, taking standard, tragic wilderness accidents and artificially inflating them into anomalies by stripping away the crucial context of rugged terrain and unpredictable weather. It is a fair critique. And you know, when you are sitting in a warm, brightly lit room looking at a tidy spreadsheet on your computer screen, it is incredibly easy to rationalize how a tired hunter might just get turned around in the woods, or how a toddler could theoretically wander 2 miles up a jagged vertical scree slope. Just because human statistics and probability demand a logical, grounded explanation for sudden human tragedy. But I always tell people, especially the armchair critics who have never been part of a search and rescue grid, that you really need to go out there and actually walk the unyielding ground where these people took their very last steps, feeling the burning in your own lungs and the sharp freezing bite of the high-altitude wind against your face, to truly understand the sheer physical impossibility of the distances and the terrain we are talking about in these official files. They never walk the ground. Think about this, folks. If you've ever been hiking on a well-worn, heavily trafficked trail in a place like Yosemite or the Smokies, you know that the exact moment you step just 10 or 15 feet off that beaten path to relieve yourself or to look at a strange rock formation, the thick, heavy canopy of the forest immediately swallows you up. And the sound of your family talking on the trail gets muffled and completely distorted by the dense pine needles and the damp, absorbing earth. And that brief, disorienting moment where everything looks exactly the same in every single direction and the shadows start playing tricks on your eyes. Panic can absolutely set in and cause a person to make irrational, fatal decisions. That, which is exactly why the National Park Service insists to this day that these are all just simple, tragic instances of people getting lost and eventually succumbing to the harsh, unforgiving elements of the wild. But that doesn't explain the silence. It certainly doesn't explain the highly trained, multi-million-dollar federal tracking dogs that are brought into the dense brush within hours of a disappearance, sniffing the damp soil where a child just stood only to sit down, whine, and completely refuse to move off the scent pad, as if the victim was plucked directly up into the sky without leaving a single trace of human odor on the surrounding vegetation. And it absolutely does not explain the institutional silence, the utter, just frustrating brick wall that I hit every single time I submit a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of the Interior, asking for a simple, comprehensive list of missing persons in our national parks, to be told by federal lawyers that no such list exists, or that it would cost millions of dollars to compile the basic safety records that they are supposed to be keeping to protect the public. They are hiding the files. When I sit across a diner table from a grieving mother who has spent her entire life savings hiring private investigators and organizing independent search parties, to inhaling the stale air of a coffee shop while she hands me a heavily redacted park police report that has entire pages blacked out with thick marker, I have to ask myself why a simple, tragic hiking accident requires the level of government secrecy usually reserved for national security threats. I remember walking into a ranger station a few years back, just an ordinary cinder block building smelling of old coffee and wet wool uniforms. And when I asked the supervisor about a specific cluster of vanishings in his sector, the temperature in the room just instantly dropped. His posture stiffened, and he told me flat out that they don't talk about those cases, period. It leaves you with more questions than answers. It's that kind of systemic, deeply ingrained refusal to acknowledge the patterns. The fact that people are vanishing right near boulder fields, that massive storms are rolling in like clockwork to wipe away the evidence, that the dogs are failing to... and that the bodies, when they are miraculously found, are often miles outside the grid in areas that were already searched dozens of times. That forces me to keep digging through the silence regardless of what the critics say. To the victims. So anyway, when you take a step back and really look at the sheer, overwhelming totality of these cases, from a little boy vanishing behind a rhododendron bush in the damp, heavy air of the Great Smoky Mountains, all the way to experienced outdoorsmen dissolving into the freezing, sulfur-scented mist of the Yellowstone caldera. To you, you are forced to confront a reality that makes most people incredibly uncomfortable. We are entirely vulnerable. I remember taking a quiet walk out near the Timberline a few years ago, just feeling the crunch of the dead leaves under my boots and listening to the wind completely drown out the sound of my own breathing. And it hit me with this profound sense of clarity that we modern humans have completely forgotten how to respect the deep woods, treating these ancient, unpredictable landscapes like they are nothing more than a manicured city park with a safety net that simply does not exist. It is a fatal mistake, and what really troubles me, what keeps me sifting through these dusty, heavily redacted files late into the night, when the house is totally quiet, isn't just that people are getting lost and dying out there because, well, you know, nature is incredibly harsh and unforgiving, but rather it is the glaring, this undeniable gaps in the official records that point to something operating completely outside the bounds of our current understanding of physics and wilderness survival. The math just doesn't work. Think about the documented pattern of the highly trained tracking dogs completely failing right at the exact point last seen, or the massive and unprecedented weather anomalies that roll in like clockwork to wash away the scent pads in the mud, or the victims eventually being found miles away in rugged, impassable terrain that would shred the boots off a trained mountaineer. They are reportedly found with clean feet and neatly folded clothes. almost as if the forest itself gently placed them there just to mock the intensive search efforts. It defies all human limits. Tourist, we have federal agencies with multi-million-dollar budgets equipped with thermal imaging drones and helicopters that can spot a rabbit in the pitch black from 1,000 feet up in the air. Yet when a child disappears near the Timberline, the authorities simply shrug their shoulders, classify it as a tragic hiking accident without providing a single shred of physical evidence, and completely refuse to acknowledge that these incredibly specific repeating anomalies are happening in documented clusters all across North America. They simply look the other way.